The air at the Miller estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the quiet desperation of a family farm breathing its last. Jedediah Stone stood near the back, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn denim overalls, the fabric softened by 1,000 washings. He wasn't here for the land. Old Man Miller's 160 acres were prime black dirt, but the auctioneer's chant was already climbing into figures that made Jed's teeth ache. No, he was here for the iron. Specifically a rusty New Holland hay rake with 2 broken tines and a bent axle, sitting forlornly in the tall grass behind the main lots. It was junk to most, but to Jed it was a weekend's worth of work and a season's worth of reliable service. His father, a man carved from oak and stubbornness, had left him 80 acres, a modest house, and a simple, profound piece of advice. Son, if you can't pay for it in cash, you can't afford it. That principle was etched into Jed's soul, as permanent as the grease stains under his fingernails. His fleet was a testament to that creed. The heart of his operation was a 1951 Farmall M. Its red paint faded to a dull, sun-bleached rose, its narrow front end a symbol of a bygone era. Beside it in the shed sat a John Deere Model B for lighter work and a tired but tough Alice Chalmers All-Crop 60 combine. They were old, they were loud, and they leaked a little oil, but they were his. Every nut, every bolt, every patch-welded fender was paid for. Going once, going twice, sold for $2,000 an acre to Mr. Richard Davies. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a rifle shot, and a ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Jed watched as Richard Davies, rich to everyone, clapped his banker on the back. Rich was everything Jed was not. He was a few years younger, with a smile as bright and wide as the grille on his new pickup. He farmed nearly 1,000 acres, all of it leveraged to the hilt. His machine shed wasn't a shed, it was a cathedral of modern agriculture, housing a brand new John Deere 4430 with the Sound Guard cab, a machine so quiet inside you could hear the air conditioning whisper. He leased it, of course, leased everything. He called it managing cash flow. Jed's father would have called it renting your own failure. Rich spotted Jed by the fence line and sauntered over, his new Tony Lama boots kicking up little puffs of dust. Stone, didn't figure I'd see you here. Thinking of expanding? He smirked, knowing full well Jed couldn't afford the gate off Miller's driveway, let alone the land. Just looking for parts, Rich, Jed said, his voice low and even. He nodded toward the hay rake. Figured I could use a spare. Rich followed his gaze and let out a short, barking laugh. Parts? Jed, that thing belongs in a scrap heap. Why don't you get with the times? The bank would give you a loan for a new Vermeer in a heartbeat. You're working yourself to death with that museum collection of yours. My museum collection doesn't send the bank a bill every month, Jed replied, his eyes fixed on Rich's. It runs on gasoline and sweat, and I own the title to both. You own 80 acres of yesterday, Rich shot back, his smile tightening. This is a business now, not a hobby. You got to spend money to make money. Get big or get out. You can't make a living plowing with a tractor your granddaddy bought. He gestured expansively at the 160 acres he'd just acquired. That's the future, Jed. Leverage, expansion. I'll have this paid off in 10 years, and you'll still be patching tires on that old Farmall. Jed just gave a slow nod. He'd heard it all before. At the coffee shop, at the grain elevator, from the slick-talking salesman at the implement dealer. He was a relic, a stubborn fool clinging to the past while men like Rich Davies rocketed toward the future. Rich saw debt as a tool, a powerful engine for growth. Jed saw it as a chain, each payment a link binding a man to a banker's whim. Rich clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was more condescending than friendly. Suit yourself. Some guys are just built for the minor leagues. He turned and walked back toward his gleaming Ford F-250, the banker practically jogging to keep up. Jed watched him go, the dust settling around his worn work boots. He knew what they all thought of him. He was the farmer time forgot, a man trying to fight a modern war with a muzzle loader. But as he looked at the land Rich had just bought, a cold knot formed in his gut. $2,000 an acre. The price was insane, fueled by soaring grain prices and easy credit. It felt fragile, like a beautiful sheet of ice stretched too thin over a deep, cold lake. He knew he was right to stay clear, but the scorn still stung. It was a lonely feeling, standing on the shore while everyone else was skating. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I have to ask you all out there, because I know you've got opinions on this. Who do you think was on the right path back then, in the early 70s? Was it Jed, with his paid-for iron and his 80 acres of debt-free land? Or was it Rich Davies, leveraging the bank's money to build a modern empire? Drop a comment below and let me know who you'd have put your money on. I'm curious to see what you all think. Jed waited until the crowd thinned, until the big players and their bankers had gone. He found the auction clerk, a harried woman with a pencil behind her ear, and paid $20 cash for the hay rake. A couple of local boys helped him hitch it to his old Chevy C50 grain truck. The axle was bent worse than he thought, and one wheel wobbled like a drunk on a Saturday night. He'd have to heat it with the acetylene torch and straighten it in the vise. The gearbox was probably full of water, meaning a full teardown, a flush with diesel, and repacking with new 90-weight gear oil. It was a solid 2 days of greasy, knuckle-busting work. Rich Davies would have just written a check. Jed smiled a little. He preferred his way. It was harder, but it was honest. And it was his. The spring of '74 came in wet and cold, the kind of spring that seeps into your bones and makes every joint ache. For Jed, it was a race against the calendar, a battle fought with old steel and sheer determination. While Rich Davies was out in his heated 4430, listening to the radio and pulling a 24-foot disc, Jed was perched on the open iron seat of his Farmall M, the cold wind whipping at his face. The M, for all its reliability, was a 38-horsepower tractor in a 100-horsepower world. It meant more passes, more hours, more fuel. One raw April morning, halfway through dissing the North 40, it happened. The M gave a loud cough, a metallic sneeze that echoed across the damp field, and then died. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow. Jed climbed down, his boots sinking into the soft, dark soil. He knew that sound. It wasn't fuel, it was a loss of spark. He unlatched the side panel of the engine cowling, the cold steel biting at his fingertips. The International Harvester H4 Magneto, the heart of the tractor, was a complex little beast of copper windings and precise timing. He pulled the cap. The points were pitted and black. He'd filed them clean just last winter, but they'd given up the ghost. No amount of filing was going to save them now. A man like Rich would have picked up the radio telephone in his cab and had a service truck out within the hour. For Jed, it was a 2-mile walk back to the house. He called the implement dealer in town. A set of points for an H4 Magneto, the young man in the parts department asked, his voice dripping with the condescending pity reserved for owners of ancient machinery. Geez, I don't know. Let me look in the old books. Jed could hear him rustling through dusty catalogues in the background. Nope, we can order one maybe. Take a week or two to get here. A week or two. With a field half-dissed and rain in the forecast, a week was an eternity. It meant planting late, which meant pollinating in the worst of the summer heat, which meant a guaranteed yield loss come harvest. It was a cascade of failure, all starting with one tiny worn-out part. Never mind, Jed said, hanging up the phone with a quiet click. There was only one other option. He grabbed a handful of wrenches and a hammer and headed for his own personal boneyard. A quiet corner of the farm behind the windbreak where the metal skeletons of past machines rested. His grandfather's old Farmall H, which had thrown a rod in '62. A neighbour's Oliver 70 that had been donated after a barn fire. These were his parts department. He found an H4 Magneto on the old H, caked in years of dirt and rust. It took him an hour of wrestling with seized bolts, liberally applying penetrating oil and brute force, before the unit came free in his hands. He carried it back to the workshop, a place that smelled of motor oil, welding flux, and damp earth. He carefully disassembled it on his workbench, laying each tiny screw and spring on a clean red rag. The case was cracked, but the points inside looked serviceable. He cleaned them meticulously with a fine grit file, feeling for the perfect flat surface, the precise gap. He took the condenser from his own magneto and paired it with the salvaged points, creating a hybrid out of necessity. It was late afternoon by the time he walked back to the silent tractor in the field. His hands were raw, his back ached, and a smear of black grease decorated his forehead. He bolted the rebuilt magneto into place. The timing was critical. He brought the #1 piston up to top dead center, feeling for the compression stroke with his thumb over the spark plug hole. He lined up the marks on the distributor gear, held his breath, and tightened it down. He climbed back onto the iron seat, the metal cold through his jeans. He pulled the choke, cracked the throttle, and hit the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, then roared to life with a plume of blue smoke. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The steady, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of a healthy engine, a heartbeat of iron and fire he had resurrected with his own 2 hands. The talk in the coffee shop the next morning was, as usual, centered on Rich Davies. Here Rich bought another planter, mumbled Old Man Henderson into his cup. A 12-row Deere Max Emerge. Gonna plant all his corn in 3 days, they say. And he's putting up another grain bin, added the local seed dealer. Got a line of credit big as the Mississippi River, that one. Jed sat in his usual booth, stirring his coffee, listening. They all saw Rich's new iron, his expanding acreage, his confident smile. They didn't see the monthly statements, the interest payments that crept ever higher. They saw Jed on his old M, covered in grease, and they saw a man falling behind. A man too stubborn or too poor to keep up. They mistook his independence for ignorance. That summer, a hailstorm rolled through in late July. It came out of the northwest, the sky turning a sickening shade of green-gray. The hail was the size of golf balls, and it fell for 10 solid minutes. It shredded the corn leaves, battered the soybean plants, and left a trail of devastation across the county. Jed's crops were hit hard, just like everyone else's. He figured he lost 30% of his yield right there on the ground. It was a gut punch, the kind of setback that could ruin a man. But as he walked his fields the next day, assessing the damage, he did the math. His costs were low. His only major expenses were fuel, seed, and fertilizer, all of which he'd paid for up front. There was no bank payment due on the 1st of the month, no lease payment on a combine he hadn't even used yet. It would be a lean year, but he would survive. He'd tighten his belt, defer buying a new set of tires for the truck, and make it through to next spring. A week later, he saw Rich at the elevator. Rich's face was pale, his usual easygoing confidence replaced by a tight, worried look. The hail had hammered his best ground, the new parcel he'd bought from the Miller estate. Brutal, Rich said, shaking his head. Just brutal. The bank's working with me, but, damn, had to refinance some things. Take out another operating loan to cover the loss. He looked at Jed, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. You get hit? Everyone got hit, Jed said simply. Yeah, but for you. A 30% loss on 80 acres isn't the same as a 30% loss on 1,000. Rich was trying to sound sympathetic, but what came out was a strange mix of pity and a desperate need to reaffirm his own choices. That's the risk you take when you're playing at this level. Jed just nodded. He let Rich believe what he needed to believe. He let him think that his own smallness was a weakness, a shield from the bigger risks of the game. But Jed knew the truth. Rich wasn't playing with risk, he was playing with debt. And debt, unlike hail, was a storm that never passed. The years that followed were a golden age for American agriculture. The mid to late 70s saw grain prices climb to heights no one had ever imagined. A massive sale to the Soviet Union had opened the floodgates. And the world, it seemed, was hungry for American corn and soybeans. Land values, which had already seemed high, went parabolic. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly millionaires on paper. The banks, flush with cash and eager to lend, fanned the flames. The message from the Secretary of Agriculture, from the university extension offices, from the bankers, was unanimous. Plant fence row to fence row, get bigger, borrow more. The boom would never end. For Rich Davies, this was his vindication. He was no longer just a successful young farmer. He was a visionary, the undisputed king of the county. The hailstorm of '74 was a distant memory, a minor blip covered by soaring profits. He traded his 4430, for a brand new John Deere 4640, a 155 horsepower beast with quad-range transmission and a cab so plush it felt like a luxury sedan. He bought another 320 acres, this time paying a staggering $3,000 an acre, and didn't even blink. He tore down his modest farmhouse and built a sprawling brick ranch-style home with a 2-car garage and central air conditioning. His wife drove a new Buick Electra. He was the living embodiment of the new farming paradigm, and everyone, from the tellers at the bank to the old men at the coffee shop, sang his praises. Jed, meanwhile, continued on his own quiet path. The boom years were good to him too. He was making more money than his father ever had. The higher prices meant his 80 acres were generating a solid, comfortable income. But while his neighbors were using that income as a down payment on more land and bigger machines, Jed was using it to build a fortress. He paid off the last of his operating loan from the year of the hail. He put money into a savings account at the bank, a move that seemed almost laughably quaint to his peers. He replaced his old all-crop 60 combine, not with a new one, but with a well-maintained 10-year-old Gleaner F. It was still an older machine, but it had a bigger grain head and a diesel engine, a major step up in efficiency and power. He paid the seller $5,000. In cash, his discipline was seen not as wisdom, but as a lack of vision, a failure of nerve. One afternoon, his neighbor to the west, a good man named Frank who was getting caught up in the frenzy, stopped his truck by Jed's fence row. "Jed, I heard the old Henderson place is coming up for sale," Frank said, leaning out his window. 80 acres right next to your north field. You got to go for it. Land like that won't come up again in our lifetime. "What are they asking?" Jed asked, though he already knew the answer would be astronomical. $3,500 an acre, Frank said, his eyes wide with excitement. "But the bank will finance the whole thing. With corn at $3 a bushel, you can't lose." Jed did the quick math in his head. $280,000. The interest alone would be more than his entire farm had grossed in his father's best year. "Can't do it, Frank. That price doesn't pencil out, not in the long run." Frank just shook his head in disbelief. "You're too cautious, Jed. You're going to get left behind. Rich Davies is going to own this whole county if the rest of us don't step up." He put his truck in gear and drove away, leaving Jed standing in a cloud of dust and misplaced certainty. The pressure to conform was immense. The implement dealer who used to service his father's equipment now barely gave him the time of day, focusing all his attention on big-money clients like Rich. The loan officer at the bank, a man Jed had known since childhood, treated him with a kind of gentle pity. "Jed, your balance sheet is the cleanest I've ever seen," he'd said during a brief meeting. "You've got no debt. You've got cash in the bank. You have so much borrowing power. Are you sure you don't want to leverage that into a bigger operation? Now is the time." Jed had simply replied, "I'm sleeping pretty well at night. I think I'll keep it that way." He was an island of fiscal sanity in an ocean of speculative madness. He kept his head down, maintained his old iron, and saved his money. He found a used International 806 tractor at an auction, a real workhorse from the 60s with a strong diesel engine. He paid cash for it and spent the winter overhauling the engine and transmission. While Rich was signing papers for his second four-wheel drive Steiger, Jed was in his shop with a torque wrench and a set of feeler gauges, meticulously setting the valve lash on his new 10-year-old tractor. He felt a deep satisfaction in the work, a connection to the steel that a man who only leased his equipment could never understand. One crisp fall evening, as harvest was winding down, Jed went to the bank to deposit his final grain check for the season. The lobby was busy, filled with other farmers doing the same. As he waited in line, he saw Rich Davies coming out of the bank manager's office, laughing and shaking hands. They were celebrating another record year. Jed's turn came, and as the teller was stamping his deposit slip, he overheard the loan officer at the next desk talking to a young farmer who was buying his first piece of ground. "Don't you worry about the interest rate," the loan officer was saying smoothly. "We'll put you on a variable rate note. It's tied to the prime. It's been stable for years, and with the economy booming, you'll have this paid down in no time." The phrase variable rate snagged in Jed's mind. He'd heard it before, but had never paid it much attention since he didn't borrow money. It meant the bank could change the interest rate at any time. It meant the farmer was taking all the risk. He looked at the young man's hopeful face, at the loan officer's easy smile, and a profound sense of unease settled deep in his gut. It felt like a trap, baited with the promise of easy money and a booming market. He finished his transaction and walked out into the cool evening air. The lights of the town were just beginning to glow against the deep purple of the twilight sky. Down the main street, he saw the massive dual wheels and flashing amber lights of a brand-new combine, Rich Davies's latest acquisition, a John Deere 7720, being trucked in from the factory. It was a monument of gleaming green and yellow steel, a testament to Rich's success and his unshakable faith in the future. But as Jed stood there on the sidewalk, a lone figure in a faded seed corn cap, he didn't see a symbol of progress. He saw a mountain of debt, and he heard the faint, distant rumble of a coming storm. The first tremor came not from the earth, but from the airwaves. It was the winter of 1980, the crackling voice on the AM radio in Jed's workshop announcing a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. To the politicians in Washington, it was a geopolitical chess move. To the farmers of the heartland, it was a punch to the gut. The single biggest customer for American corn had just been cut off. The price at the local elevator, which had been flirting with $4 a bushel, dropped 50 cents overnight. By spring planting, it had fallen below $3 and showed no sign of stopping. The talk at the coffee shop turned sour. The easy optimism of the 70s curdled into a nervous, defensive bravado. "It's temporary," they'd say, "a political stunt. Prices will bounce back by harvest." Rich Davies was the loudest voice in that chorus. "You can't let short-term politics scare you," he announced one morning, holding court from his usual booth. "The world's got to eat. Strong operators will ride this out. It'll shake out the weak hands." He looked pointedly in Jed's direction. Jed didn't say a word. He just paid for his coffee and left. On the way home, he saw one of Rich's hired men trying to get the massive Steiger tractor started. The man had the engine cowling open, staring helplessly at a labyrinth of wires and hydraulic lines. The tractor had a sophisticated electronic fuel injection system, and something in its solid-state brain had gone haywire. Jed knew that wasn't a fix you could make with a wrench and a file. That was a $200 service call, minimum, and a day of lost time waiting for a specialized technician to drive out from the city. Jed thought of his old International 806. He could practically rebuild its simple mechanical injector pump with his eyes closed. That summer, the sky turned against them. A brutal drought settled over the Midwest in July, right when the corn was supposed to be pollinating. The days were a relentless wave of heat, the nights offered no relief. The corn leaves curled up tight, trying to conserve moisture, turning a sickly pale green. The tassels withered before they could shed their pollen. Jed walked his fields every evening, the dry soil crunching like gravel under his boots. His corn was suffering, no doubt about it. But his 80 acres were on good, flat black dirt that held moisture well. He'd get a crop, albeit a poor one. Maybe 80 bushels to the acre instead of his usual 140. With prices in the basement, it would be a break-even year at best. But because his costs were fixed and his machinery was paid for, break-even was survivable. For Rich, it was a catastrophe. Much of the land he'd bought at inflated prices was hillier, more marginal ground that dried out quickly. He was also spending a fortune on fuel. His four-wheel drive Steiger, pulling a 30-foot field cultivator, burned through diesel at a terrifying rate. He had to keep running it, trying to conserve what little moisture was left in the soil. Jed watched from his own property line one afternoon as the giant machine crawled across the parched landscape, a monstrously expensive tool fighting a losing battle against the sun. The real blow, the one nobody saw coming, arrived in a plain white envelope from the bank. It was a notice of interest rate adjustment. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, had allowed the prime lending rate to soar. Rich's variable rate loans, the very tools that had fueled his meteoric rise, had become a ticking time bomb. His interest rate, which had been a manageable 8%, was being adjusted to 18%. The cracks in Rich's empire began to show. First, the new Buick Electra his wife drove was quietly traded for a used Ford sedan. Then, the half-finished swimming pool behind their new brick house sat empty. A concrete hole in the ground, collecting rainwater and dead leaves. Rich started laying off his hired help. He was in the fields from before sunup to long after sundown, the fatigue etched on his face, his confident swagger replaced by the grim shuffle of a man walking toward a cliff. One evening, Jed was in his shop, grinding a new edge on the blades of his sickle bar mower, when Rich's pickup pulled into the lane. It was a rare sight. Rich hadn't set foot on Jed's property in years. He got out of the truck and walked toward the open workshop door, moving like a man twice his age. "Jed," he said, his voice raspy. He was holding a broken hydraulic cylinder from his planter. A deep gouge ran the length of the chrome shaft. "The dealer wants $800 for a new one. Said it'll take a week to get here. I'm still trying to plant beans." Jed took the heavy cylinder, running his thumb over the damage. "Hit a rock?" Rich nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Yeah, stupid." Wasn't paying attention. Jed looked at the cylinder, then at Rich's haunted face. He could have just shaken his head and said he couldn't help. But that wasn't his way. "Give me a couple hours," he said. He fired up his lathe, a massive ancient machine he'd bought for scrap value, and rebuilt himself. He spent the next 3 hours carefully turning down the damaged shaft, machining it smooth, then building it back up with his arc welder, bead by careful bead. He ground the weld down, polished it with emery cloth until it was smooth as glass, and reassembled the cylinder with new seals he kept in a dusty box on a high shelf. He handed it back to Rich just as darkness fell. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold pressure. It would work. "What do I owe you?" Rich asked, his voice thick with an emotion Jed couldn't quite place. "The seals cost me $5, Jed said. "So $5. Rich stared at him, then fumbled for his wallet. He pulled out a $10 bill. "Keep it," he mumbled, and practically ran back to his truck. He drove away without another word, leaving Jed standing in the soft glow of his workshop light, the smell of hot metal and ozone hanging in the air. Jed knew he hadn't just fixed a piece of machinery. He had witnessed the first stone crumble from the foundation of Rich Davies's kingdom. The crisis arrived like a slow-motion flood. It wasn't a single event, but a relentless, rising tide of economic misery that drowned the unprepared. By 1982, the prime interest rate was hovering over 20%. Corn prices had slumped to under $2 a bushel, less than the cost of production for most farmers. The phrase farm auction became a constant grim refrain on the local radio station, replacing ads for new tractors. Every week, it seemed, another family farm was going under the hammer. Its history and future sold off piece by piece to anonymous bidders. Jedediah Stone endured. His life didn't change much. He still rose before the sun, still wrestled with his old iron, still ate his lunch sitting on the fender of his Farmall M. The low prices hurt, but they didn't kill him. His 80 acres, free and clear, were a life raft in the storm. His lack of debt was a shield. While his neighbors were writing checks to the bank for tens of thousands of dollars in interest payments, Jed's only major bills were for fuel and seed. He cut back everywhere he could. He ate more from his wife's garden, patched his tires one more time, and made every drop of diesel count. He was surviving, a fact that in those dark times felt like a stunning victory. For Rich Davies, there was no shield. The 18% interest rate was just the beginning. The bank, once his eager partner, was now a cold, impersonal enemy. His operating note was called in. His machinery leases were cancelled. The loan officer who had once clapped him on the back now refused to take his calls. The weight of it all was crushing. The massive, gleaming machines that had been symbols of his success were now just multi-ton anchors of debt, dragging him under. The notice appeared in the legal section of the county newspaper, a small block of text that felt as final as an obituary. A foreclosure auction. The property of Richard and Sarah Davies. All tracts of land, all machinery, all buildings. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a November sky threatening a wintry mix. The scene was a haunting echo of the Miller auction years before, but this was different. This wasn't the end of a long life's work. This was the public execution of a young man's dream. The crowd was bigger, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, pity, and the predatory glint of bargain hunters. Jed stood at the back, just as he had before. He watched as the auctioneer, a man with a practiced, cheerful cadence that seemed obscene under the circumstances, began to sell off Rich's life. The John Deere 4640, the Steiger, the 7720 Combine, they all went for 50 cents on the dollar to corporate farm representatives and wealthy investors from out of state. These men weren't farmers, they were vultures, picking the bones of the fallen. Rich and his wife stood on the porch of their brick house, looking like ghosts at their own funeral. Sarah was crying silently, her arm linked through her husband's. Rich's face was a pale, emotionless mask, but Jed could see the muscle twitching in his jaw. He was watching his entire world, everything he had worked for and gambled on, being dismantled and hauled away. The auctioneer moved on to the land. The parcels Rich had bought at $3,000 and $4,000 an acre were now selling for less than $1,000. The bankers stood by, grim-faced, taking notes on clipboards, calculating their losses. Then came the final parcel, the original 160 acres that had been Rich's father's farm, the place where he had grown up. It included the house, the barns, the very ground his identity was built on. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this prime home quarter?" the auctioneer called out. An opening bid came from one of the investors, another countered. The price crept up slowly, agonizingly. Jed saw Rich flinch with every bid, each number another nail in his coffin. When the bidding stalled at $700 an acre, the auctioneer began his final chant. 700 once, 700 twice. Fair warning, folks, it's going. 750, a quiet voice said from the back of the crowd. Every head turned. It was Jed. The investors looked at him with annoyance, a small-town farmer getting in the way of their bargain. The banker raised an eyebrow. Rich looked up, his eyes meeting Jed's across the yard, a flicker of disbelief and confusion on his face. The investor countered at 800. 850, Jed said immediately, his voice calm and steady. He had done the math. He had the cash in his savings account, the money he had so carefully put away during the good years. It would take nearly every penny he had, but he could do it. The investor conferred with his partner, then shook his head. They were done. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer cried, his eyes on Jed. Sold, for $850 an acre, to Mr. Jedediah Stone. The gavel fell, the sound cracking through the chilly air. A murmur went through the crowd. Jed Stone, the man time forgot, the farmer with the museum collection, had just bought the heart of Rich Davis's fallen empire. Jed didn't wait for congratulations or questions. He walked straight to the clerk's table, wrote the check for the down payment, and signed the initial papers. Then he walked across the lawn, past the gawking neighbors and the stony-faced bankers, right up onto the porch where Rich and Sarah were standing. Rich looked at him, his face a wreck of shame and anger. Come to gloat, Jed? Come to finally say, I told you so? Jed shook his head. He looked not at Rich, but at Sarah. The house is yours, he said, his voice low and firm. The barns, the yard. You can stay as long as you need. A year, 5 years, forever. I don't care. No rent. He then turned to Rich. And I'll need a good man to farm this ground for me. Someone who knows it better than anyone. I'll pay you a fair wage and a share of the crop. Rich stared at him, speechless, the anger in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a raw, bewildered vulnerability. He looked at the check in Jed's hand, at the faces in the crowd, and then back at the man he had ridiculed for years. He finally understood. This wasn't an act of pride or revenge, it was an act of grace. Why? Rich whispered, his voice breaking. Because this is your home, Jed said simply, and a man ought not to be kicked out of his home. He turned and walked away, leaving the Davises on their porch, surrounded by the wreckage of their life, but with a single unexpected plank of salvation to stand on. The years that followed were quiet and healing. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the community. Many faces were gone forever, replaced by the signs of consolidated farm corporations. But in their corner of the county, a different story unfolded. Jed Stone became a quiet legend. The men at the coffee shop no longer looked at him with pity. They looked at him with a deep, abiding respect. They had all been on the same ship, and he was the one who had seen the iceberg. They started asking his advice. They'd bring him broken parts from their own aging machinery, and he would always help, never charging more than the cost of a seal or a bearing. His wisdom, once seen as stubbornness, was now recognized for what it was: a profound understanding of the difference between wealth and money. Rich Davies took Jed's offer. The first year was hard. The humiliation was a bitter pill. But working the soil of his home place, not as an owner but as a steward, slowly changed him. He learned the rhythm of the old International 806, the quirks of the Gleaner combine. He learned to listen to the machines, to feel for a problem before it became a disaster. He and Jed worked side by side, two men from different worlds finding common ground in the turn of the earth. The debt was gone, and with it, the crushing anxiety. For the first time in a decade, Rich started sleeping through the night. After 5 years, Rich had saved enough to buy a small house in town. He took a job as a mechanic at the local implement dealership. He was brilliant at it. He understood the complex new machines, but now he also understood the value of keeping the old ones running. He became the go-to man for farmers who, like Jed, chose repair over replacement. He and Jed remained friends, a bond forged in failure and forgiveness. One brilliant autumn afternoon, nearly 20 years after the auction, Jed was in his workshop. He was older now, his hair grey, his hands permanently stained with the story of his life's work. His grandson, a boy of 16 with bright, curious eyes, was helping him. They were working on the old Farmall M, the tractor that had started it all. Its red paint was almost entirely gone, faded to a soft pinkish rust, but the engine still ran as sweet as the day it was built. "Grandpa," the boy said, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag. "Why do we keep this old thing? Dad's new tractor has a GPS and air conditioning." Jed stopped turning his wrench and looked at the boy. He pointed to the engine block. "You see that?" he said. "That magneto. We can fix that with a file and a screwdriver. Your dad's tractor has a computer. When it breaks, you have to plug another computer into it to find out what's wrong, and the part costs $1,000. He leaned against the big rear tire, the worn rubber smooth beneath his hand. "This tractor," he said, his voice dropping a little, "represents a promise. It promises that if you take care of it, it will take care of you. It won't make you rich in a year, but it will never ever send you a bill you can't pay." He walked over to the workbench and picked up a heavy, well-oiled ball-peen hammer, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark from decades of use. It had been his father's. He placed it in his grandson's hand. "There are two kinds of farmers in this world," Jed said, his eyes meeting the boy's. "Those who work for the bank and those who work for the land. Your great-grandfather taught me that. The bank will lend you a ladder to the sky, but they own the ladder, and they can take it away whenever they please. The land just asks for your sweat and your respect. You give it that, and it'll hold you up." He looked out the open workshop door, across the 80 acres his father had left him, and the 160 he had saved. The corn stood tall and golden, heavy with grain, waiting for the harvest. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. It was a picture of simple, profound abundance. It wasn't an empire of steel and debt, but a kingdom of soil and soul, and it was paid for.